everyone, it's time to review the Yzmir cards in Trial by Frost. After my first 3 videos about Trial by Frost, we had a major restriction and update announcement, which changed a lot of how the game is going to be played. It will change what Yzmir is trying to play against, and it will also change Yzmir specifically in regards to the Moonlight Jellyfish not being available for the few players who owned the Moonlight Jellyfishes that could loop. After the errata, the loop is definitely going to be gone. As a temporary change, no Moonlight Jellyfishes can be played at all. I think this means that Lindiwe is about as viable as before, which is she wasn't really viable before. I don't think she was performing like the other heroes was, and I don't think her builds were very consistent against the most powerful heroes in the game. I think they did great against average heroes. And I think the main impressive result we ever saw for Lindiwe was when Robin Hood was legal, and because Lindiwe is very good at killing Robin. However, it's not really clear that the Jellyfish loop was the best future for Lindiwe. A major issue with the Jellyfish loop is that if you only draw one of your uniques during the game, it's probably weaker than other uniques. And it could be very important to be able to win games even when you only draw one unique if you're trying to do really well in a multiple round tournament. On the other hand, it's a little bit less likely that Lindiwe has a really unique angle of attack into the game where her opponent's cards aren't really prepared for what she's trying to do, because the Jellyfish loop often made it difficult for your opponent to use cards like Acapella Training that would usually be very helpful, or cards like I think Beauty Sleep is a little weaker. You can still Beauty Sleep them all, but it's the Maw has an ability on the second day. So that's an example of another card that might be in the deck to deal with most other decks, but then doesn't work well against Lindiwe. The best Lindiwe decks are going to be a little bit more similar to combat to all other decks now, and I think that in its own makes her less exciting. So as we look through these uniques, the ones with the most immediate power will be the ones that go into Faunus, who has been doing the best. But I do think there's a lot here that is really promising for Akesha 2. The set was designed with Akesha in mind. And Akesha does have a few things going for her and was not impacted by any restrictions. So first here we have Amarok. This one is a little bit larger than you should get for 3 mana, but you have to sacrifice new characters that are added to that expedition. And the idea is in Lindiwe that if you sacrifice a 1-cost character, you get slightly more stats than you paid. I think this card is completely unplayable in all the Yzmir decks. It's really important to be able to threaten both sides on your own terms, how you want to. So the restriction that you can't play full-size characters to the same location as the Amarok is going to make your own flexibility reduce, and the only benefit you're getting is this really small Haven Warrior-ish thing, slightly more stats than a 3-cost 3/3/3. So I do not think this is good. My experience testing with the sacrifice gear in this set, because a Lindiwe Rough Draft is one of the few Trial by Frost decks I've tried out early on. That testing has not made me think that you need a ton of sacrifice triggers from something like Amarok. It's better to get something as a reward for your sacrifice triggers, like when you play Gift of Self and get to draw cards. So this is a D. Aurora, Savior of Asgartha. There seem to be some promo arts in the database, but it'll have the same card ability, so I'm just going to review the first one I see and move on, but I don't think you get this art in the set. You may discard a spell from your reserve. If you do, I gain 1 boost. These stats are, it's a kappa the first time, and then it's slightly larger than a 3/3/3 the second time. But Mel can already get this second time stat spread in a different distribution if you want it. So this card is really, really bad. If you have a spell that is completely free to discard, it becomes barely on rate. It is a common, so playing a 4-cost beefy character is a little less embarrassing than playing one of the rares with overly fancy effects that are only going to trade because you played a 4-cost. But despite having decent stats as a common, and despite Yzmir kind of being in a tough spot for decent stats at common, you're still not going to need to resort to this. Flamel specifically is going to outclass this a lot of times, and there's other ways to build your deck. So we're going to put this at a D. The problem is that even though it has a low floor, there just is no ceiling. There's no strong scenario, and you usually can find commons that 1/1 reliably, like a Flamel, that have some kind of upside in the right spot. The rare is a pretty different card in some ways. It's a 4-cost 5/5/5 when you discard a spell, which is still generally going to be looking at 1/1 turns. And it has the spell cost decrease ability that you can find even on the common Flamel. So we're going to give this one a D. It is not enough better. It's actually worse because we're spending a rare point, and we're not going to do something better than a trade when we do this. Note that you don't get to discard a spell the second time, which kind of would have pushed this over the edge to maybe having some uses. Belisenka. When played, you may exhaust target card in reserve when played from hand, and it's a 3/3 for 3, and then the second time it has Frog Prit stats. I think this is an A. When I have been rough drafting what I would want to do with an Yzmir deck, I have seen that I have enough slots that I just really want something like this. As mentioned on Aurora, it's really hard to find good, common, decent stats in Yzmir, and this definitely fits the bill. This is similar stats to common Inari, which really says something about the difference in what common options are available in each faction. But I think you're significantly more excited about it here, and you do get some kind of ability in exchange for your trouble. This ability will be a little bit less impactful because of how the hunt for the correct biomes has to intersect the exhaust being useful. But it's good upside on stats we're already happy with, which makes this a really good package. If this was full vanilla, we would maybe try to find a way not to play it because it's not offering any utility. But since the stats are great, and then we have this little ability to push us over the edge, that's why I rated an A. Here we have a rare that is sometimes 1 boost larger. I think since most of what we were wanting out of this common is to just tread water and trade on even turns, or maybe just plug in a gap when something else powerful is the reason that you're going to have a 2/0 turn, and not really expect it to be a powerhouse. I think we're just spending a rare point and not getting enough back here. The single boost isn't going to swing things enough, even if it's always on. And sometimes it won't always be on. It's not too hard to enable this, but you barely have to miss enabling this for this to no longer feel good. So I'm going to give this one a D as a suggestion to try out the common. Another side note is that biome polarized characters like to be common sometimes because you can just throw them away into mana when you're closing out a game and everything left is just mountains. Blizzard. This was my spoiler card You can go watch the video for that if you would like to. I was more positive about Blizzard than I will be here, because the point, and generally in a spoiler card video, you want to be super positive. There are some issues with this card. I touched on them a little bit in the video. In one dimension, the dimension of competing with Kraken's Wrath, it is a bit difficult to find as many spots that you can get 2-0s with this compared to Kraken's Wrath. But like I said in the video, the rarity downshift that you can do with this and get some better advancements than the common Kraken's Wrath is a big deal. But I think the overall impact this card has on decks is a little bit muted, and it wouldn't be surprising to just see it not quite make the cut, not quite cut in. Even when a card is a common, being a high cost slot has certain deck building costs to it. Like, you can't include other high cost commons that you'd expect to be playing around the same phase of the game, like Yzmir is the first one that comes to mind. That one's not actually a common, but it's similar. Alice is a good example. If you designed your deck and you found that the 4 stat on Alice really pushes it over the edge, and it feels like it's the right pick for an Akesha deck, you might have trouble fitting into Blizzard. I'm gonna give Blizzard a C. I have been including it in my initial rough drafts, but when I've played with it, it hasn't always been super strong. But I hear more and more about Spindles, the landmark that provides tough. So if that becomes a really important archetype, it could just be that we're playing through these day in and day out, and it would probably be the common if we did. This Blizzard costs 1 less. We have a little bit more information about what kind of exhaust options we have, compared to when I was doing the spoiler video. I would say that overall, the exhaust options are a little bit better than I expected for turning this on, because you have one that doesn't cost any mana, and a couple other ones that cost only 1 mana to turn on if you want to use this Blizzard. So while I was lower on this in the video, I'm okay giving this like the same grade but ranked a little bit below the other Blizzard. There might be a way to find a way to set this up. And another thing I'll note is that the way exhaust seems to be generating onto uniques, it seems like there's enough flexibility that you could probably add 3 exhaust slots through uniques to a deck if you were building around an exhaust theme. And so that could mean you could put together a package where you're using this rare Blizzard to create 1-0s or 2-0s that weren't normally possible. So we'll give this a C. Chrysalis. When I leave the expedition zone, create a Mana Moth 2/2/2 illusion token in my expedition. This has Defender. The Defender is not a problem if you are consistently removing the Chrysalis. And in fact, if you remove the Chrysalis and you removed it with a sacrifice, and that sacrifice has a benefit to it, and that benefit only needs to be just Maw, you are ahead because you spent 2 mana, you got a 2/2/2 illusion token, and you're down half a card, but in terms of stat benefit per mana, you're slightly ahead. You have a 2-cost 4/4/4, maybe a 3-cost 4/4/4 if you had to use Lindewe going second. However, I think the Defender is a pretty big liability, and you can already get ahead by like 1 mana of extra value if you just play a 1-cost card from reserve and sacrifice it. And that also puts you up half a card relative to the Chrysalis. It would be a little bit better as a blocking card that you just leave in play and then use the 2/2/2 Moth on the next turn if it wasn't a 2/1/2. But when I was playing with it, I found that not only was it a defender, it couldn't even defend the sides I wanted to defend occasionally because it has very poor stats for a defender. So the whole package is generally felt pretty bad. This is also a 2-cost card you're putting in your deck that is just like completely dysfunctional for openings. And a lot of the cheaper cards in our deck need to be oriented around openings, especially the lower cost characters in our deck, where cards like Magical Training aren't pulling their weight there. So I'm going to give this a D. The rare has a support ability. If you were going really deep on getting like a 2/2/2 trigger every time anything gets exhausted, that's what it would take for you to even think about spending the rare point here. I'm just going to stick with saying that the entire package is unplayable and just say that it's kind of a D, even whether or not this rarity shift is worth the rare point. Daring Porter. Same stats as Baba Yaga. Almost same cost as Baba Yaga, but not the second time, and you exhausted resupply both times. This gets you as much cards as Baba Yaga if you treat a resupply as half a card, but it imposes a delay, and you have to spend more mana the second time, even though the exhausted resupply from the second time is just catching you up to Baba Yaga. This makes this card worse than Baba Yaga. However, Baba Yaga is one of the best cards in Altered, so being worse than Baba Yaga does not mean that a card isn't good. It could be that this card just is both worse than Baba Yaga and is really good. I do like this card. I think that decks that already have some draw may do better using Daring Porter as extra draw instead of using Daring Porter as the only draw, because when I played with it, I realized that if the exhausted resupply is the only thing, if that's the only card that you would have to play for the turn because you played all your other cards and then you played Daring Porter to draw, the exhaust can actually hurt. But if you have like a lot of Magical Trainings in your deck and you have a lot of Gifts of Self in your deck and you just have some extra cards, and the Daring Porter is just drawing you like even more options and then letting you sequence those cards differently later. You could say that if you already have a lot of cards, maybe you don't need even more cards, but it depends on how much card selection matters. And it also depends whether or not resupplying a card and then maybe losing one advancement but still suddenly having enough cards to function and continue playing the game matters. So I'm going to give this one a B. I think supporting it with Vaike may help it out. We'll see Vaike later. But it does have some concerns about the slowness with which you get access to the new cards. And there's also a dynamic where your opponent gets a huge window to sabotage the new stuff you get before you get a chance to use it. Whereas the hard draw options it's competing with, like Magical Training and Baba Yaga, not that we're really considering cutting Baba Yaga. Gift of Self is sort of competing in terms of lower statted slots. Those all might do better because they go to hand and are less sabotage susceptible. Also, if your deck is having, you want your deck to be having less issues with reserve overflow to consider this. Field reinforcements. If each of your expeditions is behind or tied, you may choose both, draw a card, and token in an expedition. I think this card is a little bit worse than Magical Training. I would have sorted it the other way when I was first starting the game, but these stats they're not good on day one, and then later after day one, they start to not be good again just because everything is big enough and just a 1/1/1 isn't necessarily going to change who wins. We're excited about small 1/1/1s when they only cost 1 mana and they're part of the priority passing game, but this is 2 mana, so it's not quite doing that. So a magical training adding 1 priority pass to your deck in addition to the option to add almost no stats to the board and pay 2 is generally going to be better than this, and it's also a category of card where I don't think you'll want both. So I'm going to give this, I'll go strong and give it a D. It's actually not, it's not super obviously terrible, but I like giving strong ratings sometimes when I can. Flutter of Moths. It costs 1 less if there are 2 or more exhausted cards in reserve. Create 3 2/2 tokens, wherever you want. This card is really good in 2v2, but let's look at the rare. It costs 1 less for each exhausted card in reserve. Create 3 2/2 illusion tokens, wherever you want. So first, the issue with the rare is that the uniques I've seen that care about exhaust and the landmarks I've seen that care about exhaust, they both want you to exhaust like 1 to 2 times per turn. We saw the Blizzard. The Blizzard wanted to see 2 cards exhausted at one time. So this card is asking for something different where you're supposed to exhaust tons of things all at once to get a huge bonus. So it's kind of out of sync with the way you would design your strategy for the other cards. And I think the other cards are more powerful, because I think even if you get this down to, say, 4 or 3, there's still some risk that you just don't actually do the thing and get the 2/0. And a card that costs 7 in the worst case and costs at a rare point owes you a 2/0. The common is just going to fail to get a 2/0 like basically all of the time. This just isn't enough stats. It's 666 of stats for 5, which if you just like put a cool support ability on Atlas or something, oftentimes that still won't be enough to 2/0 opponents that have access to this much mana most of the time that you're playing Altered. It is a big spell if you're building the Khadgir Yzmir Bastion deck. But even that deck probably loads up on Celebration Day and Winter Nova and doesn't get all the way down to this as a 4th or 5th choice. So both of these are Ds. We'll go to the next one. Freeze. Send target character to reserve, then exhaust it. It costs 4 and has cooldown. It can target any character like Banishing Gate. Unlike Banishing Gate, it can be used twice, but it doesn't discard the thing you removed. It only temporarily makes that card unable to be played. Depending on what you're building for, the discard aspect of Banishing Gate can be either really, really important or really unimportant. I think with more recent decks, I would say it's generally becoming less important. It was very, very important back when we had Robin Hoods. But now that there aren't powerful bureaucrats to discard, because Waru is a little bit unplayable after the patch, I think it doesn't matter very much how many times your opponent can play their card. So I think this is better than Banishing Gate, but I'm not sure I want to play Banishing Gate either. And I'm not sure I want to play this. I think it's a little slow. I think in Yzmir you have a lot of capability to just like keep drawing through your deck and trying to find Off You Go and Beauty Sleep as fast as you can, and to even pick Beauty Sleep and Off You Go up over and over again and still manage to do that cheaper than this spell. Hathor is a little bit of a pet card for picking up Off You Go, but the more common ones are like Flamel can do it, and Flamel kind of costs 0 mana in terms of the extra stats to get an Off You Go back and use it again. There's lots of uniques that'll bounce spells back. We got a new card in this set called I can't remember what it's called. It's something like Switcheroo. We'll see it later. That can pick up an Off You Go for 1 mana, and then if you play the Off You Go for 2 mana, you would still be spending less mana than this. And I haven't counted right away whether you would be behind on card count compared to this. But this is so slow that we're going to be willing to try to find ways that are dangerous for our card count that still get cheaper than this, because most altered characters cost 2 or 3. So this is usually costing more than what we're removing, which we really don't want to resort to if we can find a way to do it cheaper, even unreliably. All that said, I'm going to give it a D. Here it is 3 costs, but the second time is 4. This is probably better because at least the first time is a respectable amount of mana, a functional amount. You're not so far, you're not costing so much that it's like almost automatically the case that you're losing on mana per stats from involving this in your play. So I think with this kind of card specifically, where you're trying to get 1/1s that would have been losses, and you're trying to get 2/0s, removal is very sensitive to how much it costs. So I'm going to give this a C. This improvement matters. Also, another thing to note here is that it costs 4 the second time, right? And that's kind of a problem. We said that 4 is not an acceptable cost. However, we also said that we're trying to bounce stuff in Yzmir. We're often trying to bounce our spells. So we can avoid ever paying this 4 cost if we're using lots of cards that recur spells back to our hand. So including Freeze in our deck can kind of be like a 4th significantly worse Off You Go that we can return to our hand over and over again if we haven't seen the first one this game. And it can also be a second Off You Go that has a little more flexibility as we play it and return it, if we do manage to run into characters that cost more than 3, although those are pretty rare. But sometimes you want to remove Frankenstein or something. Well, maybe you don't want to remove Frankenstein anymore after the Haven change, but something like that. Icebound Lake. When a non-token character joins one of your expeditions, if it's behind, I gain a trial counter. And when you pop it, you get a 5/5/5 and put something to sleep. The Icebound take is in all of my videos so far because every faction has at least one of these cards. I am concerned with these cards that they have to be played exactly in the middle of the game, and so I'm really concerned when they have restrictions that would make it difficult to play them in the middle of the game. This restriction has at least a little bit of reduction in your ability to play it in the middle of the game. I would say actually a lot. You often can't decide which side you're going to advance on. It has to be the one that your opponent leaves open for you. So I'm going to give this a D. Icebound Lake, it's the same card. We were looking at a promo version. Icebound Pass. When you exhaust a card in reserve, I gain a trial counter. When I gain my 3rd trial counter, sacrifice me. You get a 5/5/5, draw a card. This one has some of the most flexibility in when you could play it. Here's the rare version. It has some of the most flexibility in when you could play it, because you could get all of these exhausts like right at the end. You could have been playing a lot of cards that draw throughout the game, and you top deck this, and you use a support ability that exhausts from reserve, and then you play a cooldown spell, and then you play a cooldown spell, and you're already there. Based on this wording, you can get multiple triggers off something like Blizzard 2. I'm still really skeptical of these kinds of cards in general. because I think not every mixture of cards in your hand is going to be able to do this. But I'm going to note that this one is closer to being playable than any of the others. I'm still going to give it a D, because I still don't think it quite has the flexibility to be worth the rare point. If this was a common 3 cost and rare 2 cost, it'd be really harder to be dismissive of it, but this is still pretty rough. You're definitely going to blow them out when you get a 5/5/5 illusion token and put something to sleep. I'm just not confident that you'll be able to do the thing enough of the time, and your deck will be functioning with 14 rare points every time you don't do it. Same card. Icebound Tundra. I'm going to say there's nothing about this card that was different from how it was working in Lyra, so it's going to be a D. There's not enough flexibility in when you play zeros. Joyride. Discard another card from your reserve. If you do, target character gains 2 boosts. This actually gives you 3 boosts in a Faunus, which is likely why the card is here. Faunus also is drawing so many cards that he's not going to run out of cards just because this card is ransacking cards from your own reserve. So that part's going to be fine. This gets you an exhaust trigger from the cooldown if you're doing one of the decks that's kind of going for that stuff. I think this card has like a little bit of inflexibility without offering like quite as much of a stats boom in a way that makes me not want to immediately use it. For instance, if you put something like Bravos Tracer in your deck that has a little bit more stats than you're supposed to get for the mana, you can play the Bravos Tracer in either side you want. And the Bravos Tracer has like a comparable downside in terms of costing you more cards from hand and reserve, because it doesn't get to be played a second time. And then Bravos Tracer also has lower rarity. You don't literally have Bravos Tracer in Yzmir, but you end up having some similar strategies sometimes. For instance, often you play the front half of Beauty Sleep and then try to not need to play the second half because it's more expensive, so it has pseudo-fleeting. That kind of stuff. So I'm going to give Joyride a C. It is a good way to... It is one of the best ways to set up exhaust, probably. Exhaust triggers if you're building that kind of deck, because it doesn't devastate your card advantage way too much. You get to pick which half card you lose, which makes it a lot more flexible as you're losing cards compared to a character card that gains fleeting. And it's a big burst of stats. It is the comparison to Tracer in terms of the things we like about Tracer was apt to that part too. So it is better than a D, and I keep an eye out for it. It could very well be that we also play this in Akasha, probably not Lindiwe, but maybe also Akasha, because it's really good at passing priority. It's really good at adding a little bit of extra stats to the deck. It also helps you include some cards that are rough to play the second time that maybe you were interested in using in Akasha. It starts to become its own little Bravos Tracer the more and more you don't need the second card. I guess it becomes like 2 Bravos Tracers if you don't need the card you're discarding. So that's the pitch. Kelonic Heater. 2 for an exhausted resupply. You may play exhausted characters from your reserve in my expedition. This is a D. This costs you 4 mana to get 2 halves of the card back. And in exchange, you get the ability to play exhausted characters from reserve to the expedition, which you might not even want to do. And even if you do want to do it, it's like an opportunity to spend your mana a different way. It's not additional stats per mana. If you play a Daring Porter for 3 and then play a Kelonic Heater for 2, and then now you're allowed to play the character that the Daring Porter resupplied, and the character it resupplied is like a 2/1/2. You still have this 7 mana turn that has an anemic number of stats because the Kelonic Heater provided no stats at all. Mana Flare. Immediately play a spell for 5 less. These types of cards they make you go down a card to get this mana benefit that's hard to get. And they're generally only going to make it in super high synergy decks that are really weird and built very different from other decks in more than one way, besides having this card. So the deck that is weird enough where we start wondering if it makes sense is definitely going to be the Khadgir Bastion deck. I'm not sure you actually want this in the Khadgir Bastion deck even though. You have to be in a spot where you need this to start using Celebration Day earlier because you're getting beat up too much. But this has to be the absolute best way that you can use a card to just block those same expedition advancements a different way. And this is even a rare card, so you have to exhaust the entire card pool and say, I can't find a different rare card that's going to block those advancements quite as well as Mana Flare. And generally any other rare card that is blocking advancements as well as Mana Flare accelerating into Celebration Day is going to be more flexible at earlier phases in the game, or it's going to offer you more cards in hand. Because this is a fleeting spell that plays another card. So it's kind of like super fleeting. It's like not even one card. I'm going to give this a D because it's probably not going to find a home in the current format, but we will see. Token. Mobile Armory. Create a 1/1/1 token in my expedition. Defender characters don't prevent my expedition from moving forward. This is a D. There's just like not enough. There's not enough total defenders in the faction. You can just like put every borderline playable defender in a deck, and there wouldn't be enough triggers for this to be worth a rare 0.111. Moth Lantern. When you sacrifice a non-illusion character, create a 2/2/2 illusion token in my expedition. And when you play it, sacrifice a character in my expedition. 2/2 rare. This card is very, very, very good for Lindiwe. Very good. It's a win con because it's easy to develop this and either get a little bit of stats that like threatens your opponent and makes your opponent beat you so that you end up using this later and winning the other side. Or it's also cheap enough in the rare form that you can just like throw it out onto a side and not try to win that side at all currently, and then on a later turn play sacrifice effects to make a bunch of moths and try to get a 2/0 that way. Even if you're just having a really bad day, it might be a way to get a 1/1 that you weren't going to get because you're trying to beat anchored characters or something. It's just really good on rate. It also provides a lot of consistency in your ability to access sacrificing at all. Like if you're putting a bunch of characters that are questionable on the second play in your deck, like the Rare Tooth Fairy, where it's kind of unclear if Rare Tooth Fairy is worth the rare point if you are not able to sacrifice a second play reliably. Moth Lantern getting added to the deck really helps out with that because there's more sacrifice triggers, and then it subsidizes the inclusion of more of the mediocre sacrifice triggers because you'll at least get a 2/2/2 illusion token if you combo it with the Moth Lantern. I'm going to give the rare an A, and I'll give the common a B. I think you should be playing the rare because the 1 mana matters a lot, especially if you're trying to do the line where you're just not advancing at all and decide you develop it on and win the other side. It's hard to block out 3 mana to take that line. And so I think it's worth the rare point to make that possible. I think your deck is going to be built around this enough that it's not going to be in mana zone much, even though it's not, and even though it's not a character. One thing to note is that you can play it as a 2-cost 2/2/2 when Lindiwe has the first player token if you need to. So that makes it really, really reliable that you'll be able to keep this in your hand without putting it into mana if you burn that rare point on it. So this one's an A. Moth Larva. If there are 2 or more exhausted cards in reserve, I gain 1 boost. This card it's already good enough because it's a 1-cost 1/1/1, or a 1-cost 2 biome stats. 1-cost 2 biome stats in some distribution. So previously you could only do that with the Disciple. Sorcerer's Disciple, I think is the name. And now you also have the Moth Larva. No, that's not true. We already had Moonlight Jellyfish. So this is better than Moonlight Jellyfish if your deck isn't sacrificing at all, but your deck's exhausting a little bit. But it's pretty interchangeable with all of them. The Sorcerer's Apprentice is way better than this, but I think you likely want more than 3 1-cost characters in an Akesha deck. So I'm going to give this an A. But the boost is only going to come later in the day, later in the game when it's not super impactful and super important. Well, but it is also at the same time kind of a free roll, so it's a little worse than the Sorcerer's Apprentice, but it's trying to get there. The rare says you can exhaust target card in reserve, and it does the exhaust reward twice. I'm not sure that the exhaust deck will get focused enough that you want to spend the rare point on this. This would be a little bit better if this support ability could be bought for a rare point on a more expensive character, but it's important to be able to put your 1-cost characters into mana because late in the game you don't want 1-cost characters. So I'm going to give this one a D, because I think if you need to add more exhaust to your deck to make one of those exhaust synergy decks work, you're going to pick something that's not in as much risk of ending up in mana. It's possible, even if it's like completely online and it's a 2/1/2, that's too small for what you're doing when you're in a later day scenario. Moth to a Flame. Create a 2/2/2 illusion token in target expedition. This one is funny in Aphanis because you resolve the spell and then you add the boost, so you find the moth that you just created to add the Aphanis ability boost to. However, I don't think Aphanis really wants this, because Aphanis is playing a lot of characters that amplify the effects of the boosts. And you would probably have to remove a character that amplifies the effects of boosts to add this to the deck. The ones that aren't amplifying the effects of boosts are doing some other essential function that this isn't doing, like Baba Yaga is drawing cards. Your 1-cost character is being a 1-cost for spots where that matters. And Moth to a Flame giving you the little benefit of not missing your Aphanis trigger if you draw lots of spells. It's not really a benefit for the most part. It just kind of feels that way. So I'm going to give this a D. There's almost no way to get this into reserve and play it for 2 immediately. Here we see kind of the 4-cost curse again, where it's really hard to set aside 4 mana for 1 card and expect to get a 2/0. It helps to redistribute some of it helps to redistribute the stats from your 4 mana card across 2 expeditions if you want to try to get the 2/0 going. But this isn't enough total stats, it's only 4/4/4. I think if you had like a 4-cost card that was like 6/6/6 and it was starting to redistribute the 6/6/6 stats into like 2 different sides, then that would start to be good enough to like play 4-cost cards that are just supposed to win 2/0 in a vanilla way. But this is still pretty far from that. So I'm going to give this a D. Nyala Gifted Conjurer. Exhaust target card from your reserve with a card from your hand. I think this one's a little bit worse than Sleight of Hand, the spell that has the same effect, because you're mainly going to want this in, well, so in Ephanis I would rather play Sleight of Hand. I would maybe rather play this one in Akasha, because you don't get the spell trigger off of Sleight of Hand. And Akasha is more interested in like normal characters that aren't trying to amplify the effect of a boost. So I'm okay giving this like a B for potential use in Akasha. This is adding some like decent stats plus decent effect to your deck. Like after you max out on 3 common Kagir Alchemists, this could possibly be a couple extra 3-drops that are better than any other 3-drop. I guess this doesn't compare super favorably to rare Kagir Alchemist, but it could get there. Picking up an Off You Go from your reserve, or picking up a magical training from your reserve, it can be a plan for how you're going to win the game. I do like when you spend a rare point on a card that is trying to go even on expeditions and give you some kind of permanent advantage. Those can often be the most flexible game plans for winning a game. I'm going to stick with a B here. Here's the other art. Ordos Overseer. If my expedition is behind, make a token. And you can pay support ability to make a token. I'm actually like more excited about overused support abilities in Yzmir in general, which is kind of funny. This is just going to be kind of an underwhelm D. You get 2/2/3 for 2 when it's online. And that's actually like below rate for when you spend a rare point and get something. Splitting across 2 bodies is maybe supposed to give you something to sacrifice for Lindiwe, but at that point you should maybe be using the... I say you could use the cadets, because the cadets have a more useful support ability, but I would actually just not really do that. I think you should rely on 1 cost from reserve characters instead of the tokens. It ends up... I find when I build Lindiwe decks that since adding 1-cost characters to your deck is already exciting for a separate reason, it generally pays off to focus on those as a fodder instead of the tokens that you can generate in various ways. Pamola, it's an 0/3/2, and you can exhaust target card in reserve. I'm going to give this one an A. This is worse than when you have 3/0/3 or 0/3/3 or 3/3/0 for 2 mana, but that's kind of a premium that Yzmir doesn't get to access. So amongst the things that Yzmir does get to access, these are pretty good stats. And then we have an additional helpful ability on the bottom. And it's also an ability where it costing 0 and having a lot of flexibility about when to use it could be potentially powerful. So I think that makes Pamola an appealing option for for first drafts of decks, even if you don't have an exhaust theme. These are going to be workhorses that can, fill in the gaps in your stat curve on early turns or the closing turns, and can also give you a disruptive effect right at the end of the game. It's pretty similar to Tooth Fairy in some ways, but it feels like the top half and the back half are both exciting at common, whereas Tooth Fairy is kind of like a fleeting character. This is not as exciting as you'd think I would say it is. Having 2 3s is like, it's way better than 3-2. But at the same time, rare points are really premium, so even though you're likely able to play this twice, I think you probably don't want to do this. Like, you can find a spot where you're beating a 2/2/2 in both mountain and water on the common, and you can also find spots where that's not good enough, but really we're only getting 1 stat point here, since a 4 stat is probably still insufficient for the stats to mana ratio. That's another way to look at it. I'm going to give this a C. I'm not going to go all the way to a D because I have a pretty easy time imagining that sometimes you just want to infuse your deck with stats using the rare point, and it can be anywhere along the cost curve that you want to make that infusion sometimes. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is the thing to do. But I would generally be hoping for more stats, like when the Kagir Alchemist gets stats in every single biome. Rhymefrost. Exhaust target card in reserve. The good thing about this spell is that it is pretty cheap. And the bad thing about this spell is that it's a spell. It doesn't have any kind of stats of its own. If you play it in an Aphanis deck, it's adding to the tension between adding characters to your deck and adding spells to your deck, where if you draw too many characters or draw too many spells, you're in a pinch. And it seems like, well, that would apply to any spell, but it kind of doesn't, because each of the spells that draw cards that you add to your deck have a chance of drawing into a character, so they kind of alleviate your concern. And also removal spells that let you tread water and at least stop your opponent's advancement while you try to find a character sort of alleviate that concern a little bit. Well, this one requires like everything else to be running pretty well before you play it and get the boost on a character you already developed, and then exhaust something that matters, hopefully. I will give this... I'll give this a D. I really like the characters that exhaust. I think if you max out on like that 303 for 3 to try to make those exhaust decks work, hopefully you can get there on stuff like that. Again, I'll mention that without using any rare points, there's uniques at exhaust if you really need to build the exhaust-driven deck. It's really important to make sure as many cards as you can manage in your deck have stats that hold their own. This one discards an exhausted card from reserve, so you can get rid of a card forever if you already exhausted it. I'm going to give this one a D. I think the common is a little bit better. You can sort of already add finality to exhausting a card from reserve if you play Sabotage in your deck and you exhaust it at one ideal time to play it, and then you sabotage it when you get first player priority back. You won't always be able to do that, but adding a 1-cost do-nothing spell at rare point to your deck is a huge cost. So I think you should be pretty unwilling to do that if you can at all manage to be doing other things. Maybe it's possible that a deck is just so full of 1-cost cards that it wants to include either of these Rime Frosts. For example, like maybe a certain kind of Akasha deck that is finding a way to draw so many cards that it doesn't matter that this is clogging up the hand without presenting stats. But I don't think that's probably going to come together. Rocket Puffin. You may ready an exhausted card in reserve. If you do, I gain 1 boost. I think my opinion of this card has changed a lot while I'm reading the set. You can exhaust your opponent's cooldown cards with this. It says you may ready an exhausted card in reserve. So it's possible you can put Rocket Puffin in your deck and add enablers, and then like totally miss out on drawing any of your enablers. And then occasionally your opponent will just like play, say, a Daring Porter, and you can just go, hey, I know you don't want to play the thing that you hit with Daring Porter right away anyway. I'm going to play my Rocket Puffin. And Rocket Puffin is promising stats that are exciting to get in exchange for a rare point. You're getting 3 in Forest and 4 in Water for 2 costs. That's like a little bit comparable to in-faction rare Bravo's Tracer. The part where it's fleeting is still apt because it might be hard to meet this condition twice. But it's kind of comparable to that. It's not nearly as good as that. But even meriting some of that comparison with the Rocket Puffin only being able to go to the biomes where it's Forest and Water could be a big deal since Yzmir doesn't have great stats a lot of the time. I can imagine an Akesha deck that is using the Rocket Puffin to get either important zigzag turns or maybe even important 2-0 turns, where you're using, say you use a Joyride on one of your own characters, and now there's an exhausted card in reserve, and you played something that's more stats than cost. Then you play the Rocket Puffin, and it's once again more stats than cost. And you even get to play the Joyride again, if you want to. All of that is like a lot of brave talk, but I'm still only going to give it a C. Because rare points are at a premium, and this isn't playable in every biome everywhere. And it requires a little bit of setup. You'll need to put specific cards in your deck to be able to go for this. But I think this is pretty appealing. I like this a lot better than some of the other payoffs like the Flutter of Moss. The common Flutter of Moss, for example, is like a 5-cost 6/6/6. So this is like about as overstated as that, but it's overstated as that at 2 costs. So you're passing priority, and you can combo it with other cards that are also above rate to try to get a bonus advancement, or at least keep up with someone who's threatening bonus advancements. Sleight of Hand. Exchange target spell in your reserve with a card from your hand. This is a funny way of getting like a lot of boosts in a Faunus, because the spell you add to your hand might also be cheap, and now there's an additional time you can play that spell. The card you added to reserve might be a character, but you might not even play it. It could even be a Eager Apprentice. Is that the name? Apostle. I always forget the name of that card, sorry. But it's the 0/1/1 that can make spells cheaper. I think some count of this is like reasonably likely to be the thing to be doing in a Faunus. I'm less sure that Akesha wants this without the boost every time she plays it. It might be better to use Hathor. I've been using Hathor, but I don't see a lot of other players using Hathor, so it might be a mistake on my part that I'm using Hathor. I also like, I mentioned earlier about Nyala. Nyala presents a body right away to help you have more of those in your Akesha deck because you need them to play the game. And that lets you combo 2 things that you need in one with the same rare point expenditure. I'll give this a B. It is a little bit demanding. It doesn't have day one utility. And it's easy to construct hands where this card is like a problem and not directly interacting with the core win condition of the game. And those kinds of things kind of bring it down, even though it has a really high ceiling. And it might just make the cut in all the Aphanis decks. Snowball Commando. You can exhaust your opponent's card, and then you roll, and if you low roll, you exhaust your own card. Yzmir is kind of funny, because Yzmir might actually want to exhaust their own cards. Like, there's the most rewards for cards anywhere being exhausted in Yzmir. I think it's a really hard sell to pay a rare point for these stats when they're available at common. I guess we would be paying a rare point for the difference between this ability and the ability of the common Paymola. But the common Palamola's ability is just as good. And I don't think you want more than 3 copies of a Force 0 in your deck in general. So this is just kind of a D based on an overly similar card in the card pool outclassing it. Sinisa, Dedicated Ensign. If my expedition is behind, defender characters don't prevent it from moving forward. There's some interesting ways you can try to be behind in Kesha, and there's ways you can try to be behind in Lindiwe, but they're still pretty unreliable. It's also an issue that the Kesha decks that are going to be the best at being behind in expeditions to play this are the ones that are weird to a point where they don't want a 3-cost 4/4/4. They're too busy playing Kraken's Wrath and Celebration Days and tapping Kagir, Yzmir, Bastion for weird stuff. So this doesn't really have a place, and it's a D. The more caustic criticisms that I gave it in the Ordis video sort of still apply here. Nilam, the Withered Tree. When you exhaust a card in reserve, you may exhaust me to create a 2/2 illusion token in target expedition. As an arrow, you may exhaust target card in reserve. The rare is cheaper, but you don't exhaust a card in reserve as an arrow. I missed this nuance when I was first viewing these cards. So I think we're just... That's interesting. So my first impression is that I want to... If I get an entire 2/2/2 out of 1 mana shift, then I want the 1 mana shift. However, because you're already behind on stats, the 2/2/2 might not be enough. Okay, thinking it through more, I think we do just always want the 4-cost. So we lose a little bit of ability to throw day 1 going first to develop this as a rare. But that's kind of a narrow use case. Oh, no dear. Sorry about that. Most of the time, we're either going to be able to attempt to get a 1/1/1 or a 1/1 trade while we develop this, or we're just going to lose the same expeditions we would have lost if we played the rare. So I think we play the common. In terms of the build around here, the idea of adding cards that exhaust to your deck and getting a 2/2/2 every turn, which is a little bit more stats than you should get for a landmark of this cost. If it was unconditional, say. If it was just unconditional, this would be like a little bit too good. But instead we have to build around it, and it becomes unclear whether it's too good or not, whether it's good. I think this is kind of borderline, maybe on the underdog of being worth it, because if you have if you draw the part of your deck that's cards that don't exhaust, this can be really hard. It can be really hard to win a game where you miss even one trigger of this. Another issue is that, like, if you lean into this really hard and you play these, if you play the exhaust cards that are not that exciting to put in your deck just to make sure you're keeping this online all the time, the more and more you keep exhausting your opponent's cards, it can stop mattering as much that you're exhausting your opponent's cards. Like, you can run out of cool situations to disable what your opponent is doing. Or, like, you exhaust a card and then they're like, oh, that's fine because there's this other card in reserve that I've been waiting to use because you exhausted it before and now it's finally ready. So I have all sorts of options for things I'm excited to play. That kind of thing. I think that could be the way exhaust plays out. What is really important is that this provides like a new way of creating an advancement chart for Akesha to try to win. Like, your plan can be that you get multiple 2-0s after you either won with this or maybe even lose with this, because you're starting every single day with more equity than a deck that's not using anchoring or landmarks. And in an Akesha deck, you're pretty good at dealing with the anchoring aspects. So you just gotta beat the other people with landmarks, and landmarks are more and more unpopular. We just restricted one of the most important landmarks. So this is a really intriguing ability. My first impression is that using card draw to have a permanent advantage in terms of just having the best options in your hand all the time in Akesha is still slightly better, but it's a really close call, so I'm excited to see how it pans out. That kind of half committal opinion is going to lead me to give this a B. I'm going to give the rare a C. Maybe I can imagine that if your deck just like is really despondent about any chances of winning anytime you don't develop Neelam at all, maybe you would play the rare and just want to be able to play it out of your opening hand. Because it can be a little bit difficult to do a mulligan where you have to keep your plan turn 4 play in your opening hand. But I think you probably play the common. Snow Queen. Exhausted characters in reserve remain exhausted during morning. Eternal. And this one is Tough X and exhausts a card right away. This is a 7-cost 3/3/3. And you play it on day 5? Wait, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, you play this on day 5. So your opponent has to 2-0 you the turn you play it, and then 2-0 you again, and you're out of the game. I think this is way too small. I think the Tough X doesn't even matter because your opponent can just like play large stuff and advance and end the game against your favor. It does have more reliable Tough than Hydrocana does, but you can get around Tough. Unfortunately, Tough is not like, it's not synonymous with a large character not being able to be exploited for being large. So I think this is too costly to be viable. And I give both versions a D. Vaike Energy Pioneer. You may play exhausted cards from your reserve and exhausted resupply. This is way better than the gear because you're getting 2 halves of a card. Wait, you're actually getting 3 halves of a card here instead of 2. And 2 of those halves are a 2-cost 1/2/2, which is pretty decent. So you're getting 50% more stuff, and then some of that stuff is a developed card to a board instead of just a half card that you still need to spend mana on to convert into stats. I'm inclined to give Vaike an A. I think if Esmeralda was available at rare, you would be pretty interested. This might not be the best way to play. Maybe the Dairy Porter providing more stats when Yzmir wants stats is more important than Vike. And maybe you don't want to be resupplying at all because we mentioned some of the advantages that drawing has over resupplying. But this has a lot of upsides. Also, mixing the Porter with Vike is pretty appealing. This has exhausted cards from your reserve. The other ones hit characters. So this also lets you play cards like Joyride immediately. In general, this cost to stats ratio and the amount of cards you're resupplying is a little bit similar to Baba Yaga, and anything reminiscent to Baba Yaga is going to make me pretty excited. So that's why I'm giving it a pretty high grade. Winter Nova. You exhaust up to 2 cards in reserve, create 2/2/2/2 Moss, discard a permanent, and target player sacrifices a character. You have to pick one of these to not do. And the rare lets you pick the same option multiple times. If you're playing the Khadgir Yzmir Bastion deck, it's possible that you just play this as just a card you don't really intend to pay full price for. It's probably kind of helpful in that kind of deck. I think the rules changed around how Khadgir Yzmir Bastion interacts with Tough, to where you still need to pay Tough if you use that card to try to gun down your opponent's Tough creatures. So the target player sacrifices a character could help you out with that, since you don't have to pay Tough if your opponent sacrifices a character. I don't know a ton about that deck, but I would worry that maybe this isn't quite enough stats compared to Celebration Day and just like playing the rare Conjuring Seal and then having a bazillion Beauty Sleeps in your hand. There's that kind of stuff going on in that deck too. A different perspective is that if you're setting up lots of triggers, I guess you would, since this costs so much mana, you probably can't have character triggers, but you could have the landmark trigger for an additional token when you exhaust these cards. So you could get 6/6/6 in stats, and a player sacrifices a character for 8 mana. That's still not good enough, even if you built around it in the exhaust deck, actually. I'm going to give this a D. I'm also give the rare a D. If I'm wrong, it's probably going to be the common version barely making the cut in the Khadgir deck, though, I would think. That is the last card. Thank you for joining me on the discussion of these Yzmir cards. That leaves the Bravos and Axiom factions to get to later. And we will have fun in discussing those factions. One of them which has been very, very impacted by restrictions, so that'll be really interesting. Thank you all, and have a great night.